So bootstrapping, it's a subject that's close to the hearts of pretty much every Australian entrepreneur. And the reasons for that I'm sure we'll dig into this evening. And we're fortunate enough to have quite a stellar panel to talk to us this evening. These people not only know about bootstrapping firsthand, but they also pretty much know what it takes to be a successful entrepreneur in Australia. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for taking the time to be with us tonight. You too. And I'd just like to take a moment to run down the panel, ask them to tell us a bit about themselves and about the companies that they're currently responsible for.
Hi, I'm Leni. I'm a software engineer, basically. I got involved with the Sitepoint group of companies about 10 years ago as an angel investor. I've been involved with that group of companies since then. A couple of years ago I started working there full time. I do a little bit of angel investment, part-time hobby kind of stuff as well.
Hi, my name is Beck Derrington and I run, my background is PR and marketing, and the frustration of doing PR and marketing led me to start a business called Sourcebottle, and I have just launched another business called the Media Bag. Both kind of complement each other and working in that space of generating publicity and PR. And yeah.
Thanks, Beck. I'm James. I'm the CEO of Inksub. We've got a couple of different businesses. The first is EduBlogs, an education blogging service, as the name might suggest. And the other one, WPMU Dev, which doesn't suggest anything really apart from a large number of letters, but is in fact the world's largest premium WordPress plugin suppliers. And so that's me.
Thank you, James. My name's Didier. It's my office in the corner over there that you're all in at the moment. I'm the CEO and co-founder of a company called CultureAmp. The product that we're working on at the moment is a product called Murmur. It's actually our third product. It's the first one that's been successful. And it's essentially Google Analytics for culture. So we help organisations survey their staff and understand how they feel and where they're going with it. And in the last year and a bit, we've been fortunate enough to win most of the Valley as clients. So pretty much all of the companies that you would hear about are our customers. And a previous life, I was the CEO of a Hollywood visual effects company.
Hi, I'm Collis. In 2006, I co-founded a company called Envato. We do a bunch of stuff. Marketplaces where you can buy and sell themes and things, a little bit like James, and also education sites, maybe like 25 million visitors a month or thereabouts.
So the first question, first in line, is give examples of bootstrapping strategies that you've used that have been successful in your businesses.
I think the basic bootstrapping strategy is pretty simple. Find some customers, get some revenue, start learning from there, keep going.
Well, that's done, yeah. I'm not sure I can add much to that, Leni.
Sorry.
No, for me, I think it's relying on social sharing and getting some buzz. I mean, of course, I would revert to my traditional means of using publicity and PR. And because I have two target markets, so one of them vitally was journalists and bloggers. So, but I think, being present and being very generous with your knowledge and being very open to helping in any stage throughout. But and the money will eventually follow.
Much the same as Beck. Yeah, I'd say the first and foremost thing is marketing and nothing else, really. Whether it's marketing yourself as an individual, whether it's marketing your company, just getting out there. Like Collis is 25 million web views. It's a lot. Yeah, basically marketing comes before everything else.
It's hard. I mean, it shouldn't forget the reason we talk about bootstrapping in Australia is because it's really the only way to do it here, and it's a different world. You go over to the US, and why would you bootstrap? Someone will give you $1 million for an idea, you get going. It's the first thing to recognise is that it's really hard, and I've been very fortunate that I have 3 amazing co-founders And they're amazing, A, because they were technical, and so between the four of us, well, basically the three of them, we were able to build the tool ourselves without having to spend money on anybody other than our own time. But they're also amazing because all four of us had spent 15 years working at a fairly high level, and so we could afford to put a lot on the line, and we had partners who let us do that. But, you know, I think we were talking before about the valley of death. You go from, at that level, you're talking about a six-figure salary to not having a six-figure salary, and you've got to be willing to do that for as long as it takes, because it takes a lot longer than you might expect. Probably the biggest thing for us was recognising, and it took 3 products to realise, that you can build anything, but whether people care is a much better question. And the best way to find out whether people will care is whether they will pay. And so it took us a while to realise that you just turn up and you go, I have an idea for a product, you don't tell them that, it'll cost this much. And then, as Doug, who's my co-founder, is sitting in here, will tell, I have a terrible habit of going and telling people things that I know we can do by the time they look. And so you just say it's there, and then if they're willing to pay, you run like hell. So the amount of money they pay actually doesn't matter much. It's just the fact that they pay. And so we, once again, Doug and I have an endless discussion about pricing, but early on, a big thing for me was speed of sale trumps cost. I don't care if I leave 30, 40, 50% on the table, as long as they buy. And if they buy in the first meeting, I'm even happier, because it proves that I have something that they want, and that's even more valuable than the cash. So for us, that's been probably the most important thing.
Another thing on co-founders, they're also cheap sources of labour.
Yep.
Can't really afford to pay people early on.
We cost less than the Indians.
I think early on for us, there was 4 of us, so that was nice because we had 4 employees, but our staffing costs were 0 because we didn't really pay ourselves anything for maybe 2 years or so. I think another important thing is picking your business line. Not every kind of business is a good bootstrapping business. I didn't really understand this. I bootstrapped not because it was like some super intelligent idea, just because I didn't realize you could get money from other people. At that time, I was like, oh, that would have been handy information. But at that time, we just launched into this digital business, which kind of worked well with bootstrapping. And for a long time, I didn't understand why you wouldn't bootstrap, because although the idea of money is nice, control's pretty cool as well. And when you bootstrap, you have a lot of control, all of it, hopefully. But not every business is good for bootstrapping. I read a book by Tony Hsieh, who started Zappos. If you've ever read his book, Delivering Happiness, pretty cool book. And in it, obviously, Zappos is a shoe retailer, and they ran into this problem where to pay for next year's shoes, last year's revenue just isn't enough to get the stock. Phoebe had some really good tips for getting started in a sort of e-commerce business bootstrapping. If you ever have the fortune to hit Zappos, kind of size, I guess. Some of those things fall down, but I think if you pick a business which is has revenue in the door early, that's good, because if you're bootstrapping, unless you've been making really big 6 figures, you're going to need money sooner or later. So revenue early is good. And I think also a business which doesn't rely on heavy cash flow is also good. So obviously e-commerce is a bit harder because you've got to pay for stuff that you're then going to on-sell. For us, we're in completely digital goods. There's no inventory. It's kind of neat.
Answering that challenge as a startup. So there are some that require high growth, etc. Do you have examples of other businesses that you may not consider bootstrapping for?
I kind of think about like the Australian, our business and a bunch of the other businesses on the panel compete with folks in the US and Europe where there's a lot more capital availability. So I kind of think about, so they've got more capital, which gives them certain advantages, but what advantages does having less capital confer? And so I think that's a really interesting and productive line of conversation for Australian startups. There's some people on the panel that have kind of made their way. but not all businesses are good at bootstrapping. And so one of the kind of really interesting things is, you know, if I've got a thesis that there are certain kind of advantages that come with bootstrapping, that when you've got lots of capital, that it's hard to have those advantages. But there are some businesses that work out of here and elsewhere in Melbourne that are the kind of profile businesses that maybe are not good at bootstrapping. So I don't know if John Button or Glenn are here, but I think good films, to me, I was kind of thinking, you know, if the theme tonight was bootstrapping, are there counterexamples? And there are counterexamples. You know, the Adioso crew here tonight? No. So there are a couple of, there's two businesses, none of whom are here, and none of which means anything to anyone. So
I actually think probably Sourcebottle wouldn't have been the sort of business that I could have really sought external investment in, and I think I had to. It was sort of as a media style platform with the primary source of income coming from potential advertising, where the community needed to be built before there was any potential income stream. It's very, very hard to try to attract investment anyway. So bootstrapping was probably the only opportunity available to me, but I think also one of the advantages is that control, I think, and which meant that it was a malleable enough company that I could respond, be very, very responsive to the demands, which then created different additional sort of cash flow, monetization models that then flowed out of the demand. So I wasn't so heavily dependent on advertising, which is a problem for media everywhere. So, I can't think of other examples, though.
We, funnily enough, never actually been approached for a WPMU dev WordPress plugins for venture capital. That's funny. I don't know why. It's such a compelling model. However, EduBlogs has been a very different story, and we started about 7 years ago, in fact. So when you say we, I mean I started about 7 years ago with it. And for a short period, you know, kind of there were trips around the world doing keynotes, and we were very much the flavour of the month, and everyone was excited, and we talked numerous times with members of different investors who actually sought us out rather than us seeking them out. And every single time, essentially, people wanted the world for very little. And every single time it was a case of, oh, cool, well, you know, I'm really experienced, I've got lots of cash, I can put it behind here, I can do all of these different things. So therefore, if I do this, I'll make it really big. But then essentially it'll be my company. And our company, if you look at particular firms. And that just never worked for us. The whole joy that we've ever had has been about doing it for ourselves and being in control, being in charge of our own destiny and having our own liberty. And so the idea of walking out on, I have to say, I don't think anyone's ever close to paying me six figures, so it's probably walking out of a kind of lecturer's job to that particular context, you know, and then basically taking up another job for another set of employers was never a very attractive option.
I mean, an example of a company that's not bootstrapped, I think it's probably LifeX or LifeX, if anybody knows them. And, you know, they're trying to solve a really hard problem in terms of essentially a programmable LED light bulb. And that relies on a lot of upfront expenditure to get right. And it's a huge market if you can nail it. But it's also probably worth just reflecting on bootstrap and taking money is not just a binary option. I mean, we've actually taken a small amount of money. I would still call ourselves bootstrap. It was at a certain point in time where we wanted that money, we made the decision that rather than taking a contract, we would just take that money and we'd have another couple of months on it. And it's a very small percentage of the business. But technically, we're not 100% bootstrapped. I think, to Leni's point, bootstrapping is really a philosophy. So if you look at what happens in the US, most of it's about, I'll keep raising money until, well, I'll just keep raising money, basically. A lot of it is about how do I raise the next round, and you look at the rounds that they run through. Bootstrapping, if anyone's watched von Baron Munchausen, it's lifting yourself up by your own bootstraps. It is impossible. That's the point of it. Like, the whole idea is that you're going to do something that cannot be done. And so I think bootstrapping works best when you're trying to do something that everybody else tells you can't be done, because then you can't raise money anyway, so go do it. If you have a model that's so brilliant, an idea that's so brilliant, just pour money into it. I mean, Facebook worked because they nailed the model on the first 3 unis, and then they just put the foot to the floor and didn't take off. Like, I don't know if you could have done that without money. Like, it took them, I don't know how many years, but they were making $30 million cash 2 years in, which for us is a huge amount, but they were losing money hand over fist. So they did it because they were willing to buy the growth. And so there's a whole heap of arguments there about how fast you want to grow. But I think it does come down to what your preferred mode of operating is. And traditionally in Australia, I used to get asked, how do we run a visual effects company from Adelaide, which is where I was, working on Hollywood films. If you're outside LA, everywhere's a long way away. And so we just didn't even think you could do anything else. And so we did the whole thing ourselves. You couldn't have run that model inside LA. We're all here. That's part of our psyche. That's probably why I think we're good at bootstrapping. So.
For me, I think, anything you need scale or speed for maybe is not too good for bootstrapping. So scale would be things where you need economies of scale to get like a margin. So like the LED light bulb, you could probably, well, actually, I don't know anything about hardware, I should point out, but I'm guessing you could make one for like 10 grand maybe, one light bulb, but nobody's going to buy it, right? You need scale in order to really make the whole thing worthwhile, and that upfront investment is getting a prototype that's going to work at scale. Someone who knows about hardware will probably tell me right off about my 10 grand supposition later. Scale, I guess, also in like Amazon sort of scale, where they're really chasing those margins and you need the volume to get it. Speed would be somewhere where the market is closing. So there's some types of businesses which are winner take all. Seek, the job board site here, is a good example. Once they locked out the market, it's pretty hard to compete. So if you were starting and you wanted to go against Seek and they had money and you were the same size, but they have money to go after customer acquisition, so they're just going to spend big, you're going to be hard pressed and will fall behind. And yeah, I totally agree about advertising. That one's a kind of a hard one. You can get it right, but it's also difficult.
To make this personal, are there situations within your businesses, I know that some of you have gone out for investment, Didier touched upon small amounts of investment at certain times in life cycle. Are there situations where you've decided against your experience to actually not bootstrap your business?
We went through the process late last year where we had a company that wanted to acquire us for a very good amount of money, and we went through the process and decided not to take it. And my rationale to them was, starting a startup is an irrational, unreasonable idea, so unless you're going to give me an irrational, unreasonable offer, I'm not going to take it.
So that went down well.
Yeah. But going through the process made us think, we were right, our idea's working, there is a market here, there's a time window which we have to deliver on, and we, if we brought money on, we could do this right. And we managed to meet some really interesting people in the US who believed in our model and wanted to come on board. So we did spend probably 3-4 months going through the motion of attempting to do a raise. And in the end, we couldn't quite get it together, couldn't get it at the valuation we wanted, couldn't get it to work. And so we got to Christmas and we looked at each other and just said, if we spend as much time on our customers as we just spent with investors, we'd be better off. And so we pulled the plug, and things worked out. In January, we got into the black in sort of like 3 months ahead of schedule. So it was the right decision. I don't know what would have happened if we hadn't gone down that path. It was a really interesting learning cycle to hear what they wanted us to do and what they thought we did wrong and what we thought we were doing right. But it was against our better judgment, we thought we would go down that path, and then back to our better judgment, we decided to pass.
Same answer as Collis, really, just no. I honestly have no idea. Never had any idea what we'd spend it on, so there's no point in taking it, I suppose.
Yeah, I think if you were to consider investment, and I certainly have at different times thought, gee, it would be good, particularly with the new business, because the outlay initially, I was a much sort of more sophisticated bootstrapper the second time round, understanding what was involved to start another business like this. But I think you sacrifice a lot of control. You sacrifice, you certainly accelerate the process, but I just felt like, I just believe that I'll eventually get there on my own, and so it's really I'm just compromising on time. I know that I'll put everything into it. I know that I'm putting more at stake and I'm more invested in both of my businesses than anybody else could ever be. So I'm going to be probably the best advocate for that business. And yeah, the sacrifice is just time. It will happen.
In my personal story, I had a business in the late 90s, and it was my second business. The first one I had failed, and the second one was sort of a bit rocky, and I was kind of 1.5 businesses in, and my cash buffer wasn't as high as what it was when I started the whole exercise. I raised money, and about 6 weeks into my life as an investee company, I kind of came to the view that the sort of non-financial pieces of what my investor had promised just kind of weren't going to happen and weren't likely to happen. So I rang him up and said, much as I am desperate to keep your money, what I actually want to do is give you your money back. And he was good, and he took his money back, and we unwound it, and then I got lucky, and kind of 4 months later exited. So then a little while later, I got involved with the Sitepoint group as an angel investor. And just to sort of follow up on Didier's point earlier, I think there's a kind of a difference between, a 5 and 10 or 15% investment and are raising millions of dollars, like 40 or 50% kind of thing. I think they're different. So one of the hard things when you're bootstrapping is to what's this thing about working in the business versus working on the business? It's really hard to maintain both an external investor hat. I'm looking at this purely as like I'm not emotionally connected. What's the old the expression? We as people are experts at judging others, and we are experts at justifying ourselves. So when we're in the business, we're like justifying everything we do, whether it actually has value or not. But sometimes it's kind of useful to have an external kind of person who's just interested in the business as a whole, and actually that's in your interest, not as someone who's working in the interest, but as like the primary investor. So I actually think even in a bootstrapping context, that kind of role can be useful. By way of disclaimer, I'm doing a little bit of that, and you would have to ask, the people that I'm doing that with, how it's going. But I see a little bit of that in the community around here, and I actually think, by and large, that's actually working pretty well. And it's a way for sort of expertise and relationships, and this sort of perspective thing I think is the main thing, but there are other little advantages too.
Thanks very much. So a point you made there about second time around being more sophisticated, Bex, with your bootstrapping. Question came in around bootstrapping often involves a trade-off of time, money, resource, and even focus on your idea. Have you got any hacks that you can share with the audience that helped you overcome these challenges, some ways to be a bit more smart about your bootstrapping?
Oh. Well, I guess I probably would say that some of the little mistakes I made the first time round, I improved on the second time round. But in terms of that compromise, the opportunity cost, sometimes I don't even like to think about it half the time, because it's horrifying when and not even just the sort of opportunity cost if I was working somewhere else or doing what I used to do, but also just in terms of time spent with family and whatever, that sort of obsession with this passion of yours and what that actually really costs. So yeah, my sophistication was probably in terms of not being a complete sort of naive person going to getting assistance because I'm not technologically savvy and I'm not in that space. So understanding where things could slip, where things could fall down, what I could spend money on, what I could stagger, those sorts of things I probably made more sophisticated decisions around. But yeah, the others I'm still learning.
Chilling, utter, complete fear It's a fantastic hack. Honestly, it's a great thing. Once you've thrown some shit at the wall and you've found some stuff that sticks and people are able to pay for, and you think, oh, this might be a goer. Not until that point, by the way. The betting the farm thing isn't really a good idea prior to that point. Just once you've actually figured it out, then go all in on yourself and see where the prospects of your mortgage going down the pan and your family being incredibly disappointed with you and you being a complete failure in front of hundreds or possibly thousands of people is a very, very motivating hack.
Yeah.
Indeed. I think, we went through 3 products, and what we realised on the first product, we spent 18 months before we essentially decided that the business model wasn't going to work on the first one. We spent 6 weeks on the second, and then we kind of nailed it on the third. And the biggest learning point for us in that whole process, well, it was a few. One of them is that when all you've got is your time, you're actually very lazy with your time too, because you're kind of like, it's your time, you do what you want with it, and so you fall back to your own patterns. We're software engineers, and constantly forcing yourself, and sometimes it's easier, to Leni's point, to have somebody else do this to you, and it's what I tend to do with most of the companies that I talk to, is just go, well, have you tested that? Because it's actually the existential problem that you have to solve, not the executional one. Should you exist at all? And that's usually really easy to test, because it just relies getting on the phone and talking to somebody and going, will you buy this? Assume I can do it. You're taking my call, you trust me. Assume I can deliver it, will you buy it? And forcing yourself to get out of your comfort zone and get that before you do anything else. Because it's just so easy to fall into doing all the other parts of your business and not the bit that actually matters, which is do enough people care that they're going to buy whatever it is I'm going to build. So it's probably the best hack I can give.
I think it's good not to spend too much money if you can manage it. We were freelancing, so that was good in the sense that it was flexible, so we could keep doing a bit of freelancing work while we were starting to work on the business. I tend to think with bootstrapping, you kind of have to pay one way or another. You're paying with your time and crappy living for a while sometimes. I stayed in my in-laws' basement, which was part of this old shoe factory. It used to be a urinal. It wasn't really a picture of aspiration. Kept working kind of 2 jobs, didn't take any days off for the better part of a year. Yeah, I think it was, we had focus though, definitely had focus, and there was time to focus, because yeah, the giant fear of failure. I'd just gotten married. 6 months, it was 6 months from setting out to actual launching something, which is kind of a long time. Probably Lean would say that's a really, really long time. But there was a point maybe a month before where I thought it all had come to nothing, and it was terrifying. Newly married guy living in his in-laws' basement with no money, lots of debt, and nothing to show for it. Just kind of makes you wake up and think, no, I'm going to make it one way or another, and work a bit harder, work a few more nights, work a few more weekends, and somehow knock it out.
If bootstrapping delayed the launch of your product, in hindsight, did that delay pose a real risk to the success of your idea? Do you want to start here? There we go. We'll shake it up.
Okay, yeah, we'll move it around a bit. Much the same as Collis, really. When I did quit my non-six-figure paying job, we basically went on to consulting and making stuff for people, and so that led to us being in a position where we could concentrate some time and effort in building up EduBlogs and building up WPME Dev. However, the thing is, if we hadn't done that, if I hadn't had to build like massive WordPress multi-site websites for Brazilian ISPs and Norwegian newspapers and Australian farmers, farmnet.com.au, by the way, great site, you should check it out sometime. It's my first ever client. He comes down every now and then and we go out for a beer, it's great. But if I hadn't actually done that, what I wouldn't have gained was the expertise in the area, and it's a serious thing to touch upon. I don't think that it's necessarily possible to start up a great company in an area that you are not an expert, if not the expert in that particular area. And for me, bootstrapping was essentially an entirely unintentional way of becoming that expert. And so when it came around to building plugins in the style of Bunnings Warehouse, where everyone could pick them up and go and use them themselves, we were, kind of 9/10 down the track in knowing how they worked. And so, yeah, I don't know. I think the delay was a good one.
I mean, I think often, and particularly in the US, they always talk about, are you going to miss your window and all this sort of stuff. And I think most of the time it's rubbish. People don't know really what's coming. And there's also different sizes. So early on in my career, I met a guy who ended up selling his company to Sony, and they had 7 engineers, and they built this tool that was just unbelievable in the world of visual effects. And then Sony bought them, and the team went to 75. And 18 months later, he said, we have not shipped a single thing, because all of that's is all internal work. So being small, you can go far. It doesn't matter necessarily how many resources, how fast you go. And a lot of the external pressures are just that. They're just external pressures. But the thing about whether or not you went too late, somebody coined it, I can't remember if it was Eric Rice or somebody else, who said, if you're not embarrassed when you ship too late. And so there's definitely a discipline of just going, it is going out. No matter where it's at, whatever we have to do, it goes out, and then we do it again next week. Because that's the real thing, is there is no launch. You just keep going, and you keep building until you get it right.
When I started in 2006, I was convinced that the 1990s was like the time to start startups, because back then I used to read about them, and they had like Aeron chairs and crazy parties and stuff. And I was like, 2006, man, all the good ideas have been done. Amazon's out there and Google. Not that either of those would have been my idea, but I was pretty sure it was the heyday was past. Turns out, obviously, now in 2013, we look back in 2006, seems like a pretty awesome time to start an internet business. I'm pretty sure that in the future people will look back at 2013 and be like, that was also a pretty cool time to start a business. There was a graph that came out last year from Business Insider showing like total e-commerce in the US, and then total commerce. So like total commerce is like this massive graph, and then e-commerce is like a tiny sliver at the top. The vast majority of business is not done online. There's still a huge realm of disruption yet to happen. So I think the window thing, at some level is a bit of a mirage. Even the business that we started back in 2006, there's still plenty of disruptors in our industry still appearing 7 years later, who I still look at and think, wow, that's an awesome idea. These guys have executed on the same thing really well 7 years later. Doesn't mean that I don't look at them seriously and think we're going to have to keep an eye on these guys. I think also the other thing about the time thing is, as James says, it gives you time to get better at stuff. Maybe some of you guys are awesome entrepreneurs. I was a totally rubbish entrepreneur. I really didn't know very much at all about very much at all. I was a web designer, developer. I contacted a guy who used to develop with me, and I was like, it's going to take 8 weeks to build this marketplace. And he was like, really, 8 weeks? I was like, yeah, totally, 8 weeks, it'll be fine. This is 7 years later, we're still working on the same app. A few more features than it used to have. I think that with bootstrapping, you really need to embrace the constraints that you have, which is you don't have very much money, so you can't spend a lot on marketing, so you have to do it more guerrilla style. It's going to take you a while to build up your customer base, so then you should spend more time with the customers you have to learn as much as you can. You shouldn't underestimate the weaknesses there are when you have money. It doesn't always breed discipline. When you have no money, you have to be disciplined. When it's your money, you're extra incentivized to be disciplined, especially when you have no money, because then you're like, well, it's this or meals or, and that sort of discipline is very valuable. I think there's discipline, there's benefits rather on the marketing side, on having more time, on being little, on being the underdog, on being forced to rely on yourself, your own brand, your own persona in your marketing. You're not paying paying for marketing, you get out there and do lightning talks or do demos, like some of the really fantastic stuff you saw here today. These guys are out there selling themselves. When you have money, it's too easy to think money's the solution. When you have no money, it forces you to think laterally, think outside the box. So I think in a way, it's a downer, but that's not a good way to think about things. It's like awesome, I think.
I'm going to go against the grain a little here and say that that I really think there's a big benefit to getting that sort of first mover advantage, even if it's just kind of a basic concept that you're building on. And I think I was talking to Seb earlier today, and we're talking about beta phase, and I said, what, you know, is it just give you an opportunity to make mistakes and people forgive you? And we kind of decided, yeah, that's exactly what beta phase is. And I think I totally agree with all the constraints that being a bootstrapper or just having a very lean startup means you think creatively about how you go to market. But I really, really say it shouldn't sort of slow the progress or the rate to get to market, even in sort of a preliminary format, even in a beta phase, because I think that's kind of important, and to be flexible and improve on the way, and maybe have a strategy of how you're going to sort of get it to a point where it's not just 80% there, it's a little bit closer. But of course, I don't know who said it on the panel, but it's wise words. It never stops. You're constantly innovating and developing.
Well, so a couple of other people talked about Beck talked about a first mover strategy that's come up. There's another kind of strategy called a fast follower strategy. So you can kind of Google first mover strategy and fast follower strategy, and you'll read it on Wikipedia. Fast follower strategy actually can do pretty well. So one of the advantages fast follower strategy has is that someone else has gone first and kind of figured out something about the market, made a bunch of mistakes, spent a bunch of time. Sure, they have some learnings, but you can come in and go pow and kind of get a whole bunch of momentum up. So that can actually, so this issue about do I launch first or do I launch second kind of relates to which of those two strategies is more effective, and there are plenty of examples of both. Fast follow strategy actually kind of has slightly more runs on the board. So which actually kind of goes back to the previous question about, how do I, where are there some hacks in my startup, and how the hell do I avoid spending any money? Hack kind of also then relates to like where are you spending the money? It's probably on developers like building shit that people don't want. So when the thing fails, it's probably not because you don't have developers or there's some quality issue. It's because, and it's not just your project, it's like the vast kind of numbers in the kind of rate of failure in the IT industry is that, people are building stuff that other people don't want. So that is a pretty kind of good little hack that relates to this question. Like, it's far more important to build stuff that someone wants than it is to be first or second or whatever.
Thanks very much. So this cost and being conscious about your costs is something that came up from a question from Bryn. How far should this go? What can you skimp on and what can't you skimp on? Ideally from experience, maybe.
I mean, there are no hard and fast rules, obviously. I think it comes down to philosophy. Once again, if you start with a zero budget, you tend to be a bit more creative. So I, for example, find it, in all the businesses I've ever been in, I find it really hard to pay for a conference. Like, it's just not something you do. So you find another way. You turn up as a speaker, you offer to help somebody load their table or whatever it is. There's a bunch of things which I've just never paid for conferences. So I don't think I ever will start. Even if I have a marketing line, I'm not going to want to spend money on that. And all the way through, there's a range of things like that where you go, there's got to be another way for us to do this. There's got to be another way that we can make this work. So maybe not right up front, but certainly once you're in the growth phase, trying to understand where your value activities are. And Doug and I spend a ridiculously disproportionate amount of time entering things into an accounting system, which adds very little value to anybody at all and is not a good use of our time. And so there's a range of things like that where you should, as soon as you can, get somebody to help you with that stuff so that you're doing the stuff where you're actually making a difference. So it's about looking at the whole process and starting with a zero budget line for everything. I mean, everything. And then as things come up and you go, yeah, this will make a difference, I'll spend money on it. And if you're in a SaaS model, one of the things you have to recognise as well is that your cash flow is screwed to start with. Like, having gone from, I ran a software business where you used to sell stuff up front, and now running a software business where you do SaaS model, it's beautiful once you pass the threshold, because it's this monotonic curve where I know exactly how much money I'm going to have next month and the month after, the month after, the month after. But for the first year, it's hell, because you're earning 2-3 grand. And you have to keep reminding yourself that as long as the model works, it's just time. And don't freak out because you've only got 3 grand coming in. You've got 3 grand coming in every month for the next 12 months. And it actually surprises me when I read on the net how few people actually understand the economics of a SaaS model. And so they sit down and mount an argument for why it's better to charge up front. There are cash flow reasons, but there's other huge advantages to having monthly models. So understand the model you're trying to prove, spend everything you can on proving that model. Once you've got that, then you worry about spending real money on trying to make it go fast.
I think it's good not to skimp on people generally, software development in particular. If you're a software startup, I guess. Maybe if you weren't a software startup, maybe you can skimp on it, I don't know. But if you're a web startup like we are, I think it's pretty important you build a good foundation, you have something to build on. Your code base is probably going to be stuck with you for a really long time. It's also good not to skimp on things you don't understand. We were kind of cheap about getting an accountant early on. Turns out that's not a good idea. Paid the price later on when we had to redo lots and lots of things. Same with legal advice. Yeah, I think there's like those things that you don't get. It's good to make sure you've invested in them. One of the benefits of taking investment, which I guess is the flip side of what we're talking about, is if you could get advice. You don't have to have an investor to get advice. So in the early days, if you're bootstrapping, you could be looking for a mentor or someone who's nice, willing to give you some free advice. My dad helped, but it was only a few years in after we'd made a lot of mistakes. I think he felt like he should give us some space to screw up first. But yeah, I think that's sort of, if you realize that and early on you try to get some advice from people who do know what they're talking about, that will help you to, like, rather than just spending money on lots and lots of expensive accountants because you don't understand it, at least you can be sensible about it. I think you can skimp on stuff that's not actually really important. If you don't have any employees, then an office space maybe is not that important. It kind of depends. Maybe it is important to you, I don't know. And if it's stuff that you know really well in the early days and you've got no money, you can just do it yourself. That's always a good way to skimp. Yeah, I think...
Cheers, man. So I'm just hoping there are none of my staff here tonight. Actually, no. It's not quite like that. I would advise you not to skimp per se on anything, but there are ways of looking at your own value. And when I started the business 5.5 years ago, I made the most expensive, costly, and traumatic mistake of my entire life, which was to go 50-50 as a co-founder. Developer in Alabama who was really good at developing stuff, and we did some nice projects together and all of this, but it quickly became apparent that he wasn't really that into the business. He'd, kind of made a bit of money, he bought some jet skis, got a condo down on the Gulf Coast, and spent quite a lot of time there, not doing any work. Anyway, so the problem was, basically back in the day, I could have said to this guy, look, I'll employ you. And that would have worked out just fine. I certainly could have said to him something like, look, you can have 10% to 20%. That would have worked out just fine. I went 50-50, and I'm paying for the next 7.5 years for that particular mistake. And I did exactly the same thing. Then ongoing, I started hiring people and paying them the kind of rates and ideas and things which I thought was fair, and the kind of conditions and reasonable. Put it this way, no one ever argued with me. No one ever said, oh, can I have some more? They just kind of went, oh, bloody hell, all right, how's that? And all of that was, a big brain fuck on my behalf, basically around my kind of value and worth, and kind of what people were prepared to work with, and what was a fair way of working with people. And so nowadays, I'm very competitive when it comes to discussing compensation and contracts with people, and I think that's a very important thing to do. Also, it certainly is the case, if you are prepared to put in like kind of an immense amount of time and effort on Odesk, on Elance, on freelancer.com, or maybe microlancer.com as it comes along, or Freelance Switch, to name another of Collis's projects. If you're prepared to put the time in on there, you can find amazing people offshore who are very comfortable with rates that you wouldn't see in a million years working here in Melbourne. And that allows you to achieve a great number of things. And as long as you work really well with them, you look after them. We're taking everyone to New York, taking 35 people to New York in a few months. And that's fantastic. But as long as you look after people and stay in that situation, you can have competitive salaries, and you can pay people a competitive amount of money, and don't make the same mistake that I did.
Look, I think that's invaluable advice. I agree. I don't think you should skimp on things like legal and sort of structuring the businesses and things. I also think it really is very much dependent on what your skill set is, and then what value you place on your own time. And in the early stages, well, I personally didn't place a lot of value on my time. I lived, breathed, slept, and the business, and I must admit, so obviously I was just worthless, but I couldn't skimp on development because I don't have that expertise, and I really wanted someone good because I felt that was one area I just wasn't prepared to. I just felt I had to back myself, and I had to back the idea and make that investment, and work really, really hard in my other business so I could afford to make that investment. So I'd never skimp on those essential skill sets that you need externally. But I do also agree, I've got VAs in a couple of different places, and they're invaluable and very affordable, and it means that you get a lot more done affordably.
You're probably bored of hearing the word skimp. So this startup thing is a bit more, even whether you've got a SaaS business or not, this startup thing is probably more akin to a marathon than a sprint. So things you can consider not skimping on are like fitness and health and exercise and all that stuff. Relationship is another one. Because if you're in it for a while, like you need to be able to keep going, and health, all that kind of stuff are things not to skimp on. Things you can skimp on are the number of features in your product. Do you really need all of them? Another thing, just like looking at the business stuff, not to skimp on is, we all have strengths and weaknesses, and we've got limited resources when we're bootstrapping a startup, and yet the set of problems that we're facing demands probably more than we have, and we're strong in some areas and weak in other areas. So I think it's good not to skimp in kind of honest assessment of that, and investment in kind of mitigating strategies around where we're weak. It's not necessarily about money, but there's things that need to be done in order to make the business successful.
Can I just throw one thing just to go from saying that? It's probably not relevant when you start, but it's something that I've noticed in talking to some of the companies we work with and so on. As you get a bit further down, one thing that you don't want to skimp on once you do have a bit of money is security. Particularly if you're running a software business, it's actually really interesting watching the way the world is going. And when you start up and nobody knows who you are and they don't care, that's fine. But once you've got 100 or 500 or whatever customers, security becomes a really big problem. And I know a lot of companies that have got a ton of money that wish they'd invested in security earlier. So it's just something to keep in the back of your head, that a year or 2 years in, if your idea is good, you should start really seriously thinking about that.
What makes a good bootstrapper?
They're good at startups generally. I think people who can make quick decisions, Making quick decisions is pretty important because you sit on things and it takes time, and time is money, and blah blah. So quick decisions are pretty important based on kind of limited information. Is an art that develops over time. I think people that are humble and listen to their customers and have a feel for that and can integrate, like, so the quick decision thing then means, like, okay, I have to make, a decision on what this web page is going to do, or what this site's going to do, and who the customers are, and what's going to say, how it's going to work, I feel like I want to ask Mark Harbottle in the back there what makes good bootstrapper, but just watching him work, kind of people have a feel for the customers and just kind of quickly integrate a whole bunch of different things, like, what's my development team, or what's their capacity, and how can I get things done, and who are the customers, and what I'm supposed to do, and what's the business model, and how's it going to work, and just go, okay, that's going to be a week, and boom. So quick decisions as a two-word thing that covers a bunch of different stuff.
I don't know whether I can. I think I think that's kind of qualities of being a good leader too, really. And yeah, not procrastinating, not being overly perfectionistic too, if that's even a word.
That sounds good. I don't know. I think being passionate about what you're working on, and that doesn't include being passionate about having a startup. Which is probably a mistake I've made in a number of areas before. So yeah, just being passionate.
I think being naive is probably the best thing for a bootstrapper. Just not knowing how hard it is makes all the difference. So it was true in Hollywood, and it's true in the Valley. Like, I turn up and I have meetings with people, and then I'm saying to them, and they say, how did you meet them? I'm like, well, I didn't know I couldn't. Somebody introduced me, and I said, can I come and talk to you? And they said, sure, and we chatted. And you get through so much when you don't realise what you can't do. And it's the greatest gift you can have, I think, when you start out. Because if you knew, you wouldn't start, because it always takes 10 times longer and it's much harder. But yeah, being naive, I think.
I think on a practical level, it's good to be a generalist, someone who's kind of flexible with what you're doing, just because there's so much to do. I think on a sort of character level, there's a great essay from Paul Graham, the guy behind Y Combinator, where he talks about a little like Leni was saying, that it's kind of founders, bootstrappers. I think it's kind of the same, the sort of things that make you good. And according to Paul Graham, it's being relentlessly resourceful. The bootstrapping, starting a startup, doing all kinds of things actually in life, not easy. And I think it's important that no matter what sort of obstacles are coming at you, that you're just going to figure out a way. Come hell or high water, you will make it work. And sometimes it's the hell bit, unfortunately, or the high water bit. But yeah, relentlessly resourceful.
Is Leni Melbourne's Paul Graham? Just out of interest. Just wondering.
All of the above. So, I mean, anybody in the room who runs their own business use SendGrid? Anybody? No? Yeah, a few people? Yeah, so, if anyone's following the story, there was a situation that happened at a conference and someone lost their job, and then DDoS, and then that affects everybody else. So from that point of view, that's a hacking, if you like. I mean, customer security is enormous. I'm sure they wouldn't mind me sharing the story. I'm good friends with the two founders of Atlassian, and they had an incident years ago. And I know Scott was on holiday at the time, and Mike called him, and for them, that was a catastrophic event in their company. And it was just a situation where someone had forgotten, as they said in public, someone had forgotten to drop a table. And so that was accessible, and that put their whole business at risk. X number of weeks later, they signed the deal with Excel and took all that money. So it changed very quickly. But what we're seeing is the sophistication. Like we just saw in our own business on Saturday, the first time we saw somebody actually try a Metasploit attack on us directly. And it's kind of like, oh, this is interesting. And we're not very big, that people are trying that stuff. And once you lose your reputation, you're gone. So whatever you're doing, it's becoming earlier in the process where you have to worry about that fact, and the sophistication that's required is increasingly high. So, we're patching our servers weekly, And keeping on top of all of that is hard. I'm lucky that I have 3 co-founders who have that skill set. If you don't, not on day one, but at some point it's a reality, and it's something that customers are increasingly asking for too. Once you start dealing with enterprise above a certain size, the security deeds are pretty horrific. And I can say this as well, in being in Hollywood, I got my first taste of that because we worked on a film that was supposedly leaked, and being investigated by the FBI is not much fun.
How much customer discovery should you do, and when do you call it a day?
There's actually, you know, politicians have a way of answering questions that they want to, like, they find interesting. You've asked one question and I'll answer a different question. But there's this whole, I was having a discussion today with one of the companies in our group about UX and how important UX is and the UX people. How many people here work in UX? Okay, maybe one of you people could answer that. But, you know, they spend time talking to customers and really understanding the needs and doing panels and research and figuring everything out in advance, and then someone else actually goes and builds some shit and they've launched it and they're 3 streets down the road while the UX people are coming in for pizza. So, but then, you know, maybe the UX people actually kind of, maybe there's some value in all of that. So, I mean, what I see, you just look around the world around you and like the companies that do really well are somehow good at both UX and they get things done quickly. So did they get the UX done because they had UX people and they went through that process? And did they do it quickly? Well, if you've got a really good UX person that's really integrated with everything else, then maybe you can get away with it. But often that's a bit slow, it takes months. So, and it's really important to be able to move quickly. So I guess the question is, how quickly does all that stuff take? How long does it all take? That would be good to know in your question.
Yeah, I'm always a little bit sceptical of some sort of research. I don't know if I could trust that many people if I said, look, would you be prepared to pay for this? And they said, yes, I would. Them actually fronting up and paying for it is something entirely different. And I don't know, sometimes it's taking a punt. And I mean, you must have I think sometimes it's trusting your gut a little bit too. Do you have a gut feeling? Do you think you've collected enough data now? You know what the demands are, you know what your product should be. I mean, I kind of think there's a real value in that too.
Absolutely. EduBlogs started off as a blog directory for education blogs, and then it became a Drupal website, which was attempted to be a blog community. And that was before it became EduBlogs. And I discovered very quickly that neither of them worked because I am blessed with the fortunate talent, or if you will call it affliction, of being a relentless self-promoter. And so I had one of the early EdTech blogs, and I knew that hundreds, maybe thousands of people were seeing them and not using them and finding them to be absolutely rubbish. In our time working with WordPress, we've had Buddy Dress. That was a Buddy Press theme agency, Buddy Dress. Did you get it, themes? Didn't work. Complete failure. Blogs.mu, which I thought was a great domain name. Mauritian, that's the one. And that was a multi-site installation. Yeah. So you didn't get a normal blog, you got a multi-site blog to give other people blogs. One person set up a site called Bacon Blogs, and that was pretty much all that happened. And that took us like 9 months. But the reason, and also there was WP.mu, that was an installation service. There was WP Plugins, a plugin marketplace, which also abjectly failed, unlike Collis's Code Canyon. The reason that I discovered that these failed comes back to what I said at the start, which is marketing. I have always had from the start, been so fortunate to have, and now have more than anything, a really, really big audience. And I can throw stuff at that really, really big audience, and if the audience likes it and buys it and says, oh, this is cool, then we'll carry on doing it. That's happened with 2 things so far. But if they don't like it and it doesn't work out and nothing really happens with it, then we can just kill it. So, yeah, you just got to market. And then if you've got the eyes, then you'll find out. It's that easy.
I mean, I'm probably just wired this way in that if you do a Myers-Briggs, I'm Intuit off the scale rather than Sensate, so I tend to trust my gut rather than the numbers. but I also don't, on the whole, I think people like precision, and the precision is often illusory. And so top-down models, I think they're useful for getting an order of magnitude. So if 6 people look me in the eye and want to buy my product, that's extraordinarily valuable data, because if I've got nothing else, I've got 6 customers. And then I'll do a little test and go, well, what is it about those people, and is there the right order of magnitude? So when I started the company, I wrote down 3 things. It was 3 years ago. I wrote down 400 by 250, 400 by 2,500 equals a mil. 5,000 by 2,000 equals, 2,000 by 5,000 equals 10 mil, and 10,000 by 10,000 equals 100 mil. That's my business plan. I want 10,000 customers to spend $10,000 a year with me. And I was able to prove pretty quickly that people were willing to spend 10,000 or more. And so the pure question is, can I get 10,000 customers cost effectively? So that's the whole thing. And so when we look at it and we go, well, our sweet spot's 200 to 2,000 person companies of a certain type, all I care about is, am I an order of magnitude right? Am I in a market where there's only 10,000 people and I want all 10,000? No. So that's all I need. But back to what Beck was saying about, it's not enough for somebody just to say they will buy it. They actually have to buy it. And so we would do all sorts of things up front. We still do from a hack point of view. If I'm going to sell somebody my software, our competitors tend to charge annual things, and it's a big contract and you enter in for 3 years. We go, it's a monthly payment and you're not locked in. And so it just takes away the risk. And so they go, well, if I don't like it at the end of the month, I'll give up. We have a very, 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 very low churn rate, because people don't once they start. But if we hadn't offered that up front, they probably wouldn't have done it. So that my first customer was only committing $400, not $4,000 or $5,000. But now they've spent 15 with us. So it's just that matter of trying to take away the risk so that you can get them to sign and give you that little bit of cash and use that for your market research.
I'm always a little bit scared when I meet someone who's starting a business in some arbitrary area they don't really understand very well. They're like, you know, health. There's a lot of money in health. I'm going to research this space. I think it must work. It's like what I used to think business was. You put on a suit, you identify some space where there's lots of money, and then you like crush it with your big businessman fist. Personally, I guess I believe one type of research which I think is really good is knowing the problem space yourself. Before we started at Envato, our first product was a Flash marketplace. You can buy and sell Flash back when Flash was kind of cool. It was a while ago, for the better of the web. Yeah, and at that time, it wasn't that we just went in there blind. I'd used to sell Flash on another site, on another marketplace. So I had actually sold the product. I knew the product sold. I'd been on a marketplace, so I understood how the marketplace worked. I understood all the mechanics of it. And I'd been on the end where you didn't get that much money, and thought, wouldn't it be great if we owned this marketplace? And that marketplace is a great site called iStockPhoto if you buy stock photography. They're freaking enormous these days. And they used to sell Flashes like a tiny little bit, and I was like, you know, what if we just focus on that little niche? And so in a way, I guess we had done research. I think that was quite useful to know all those things up front. It certainly lowered the risk. We weren't doing something blind. Although I do hear there is a lot of money in health.
At what point do you explore the government for funding, and at what point do you give up?
Don't do it. No, it's not that simple. It depends upon the structure of your company, a different approach. If you, like us, have a family trust, essentially kind of structure with company hanging on to it, the R&D grant is essentially pointless. But PricewaterhouseCoopers won't tell you this. What they'll do is they'll make you go through 6 months of meetings before you find that out. So yeah, look, I mean, it's a possibility. It's certainly a good way to get it back, but you've got to make sure you're structured well up front. It has to all come through the R&D company and paid specifically through the R&D company, or else you're just going to get taxed twice, and it makes absolutely no sense. So make sure your structure is good.
Given that Doug's my co-founder, I'll probably go. Okay.
For the first 10 years, we all collectively said, what a waste of time, let's just not get involved with the government. But there's this arm of government called Commercialisation Australia that has like 4 different kind of programs structured from like very early stage all the way through. And there's, you know, I think there's 4 or 6 people who are like reasonable people in Melbourne that you can just ring up and say
They're reasonable.
they're not like the government bureaucracy fill in the paperwork. They're like, yeah, I've run a business, like I understand where you're coming from. You can actually ring them up and say, like, have I got a chance? They're much better than to ask us, and this is where you fit. So you can quickly get a feel for it. And then there's other people out there that'll say, look, I'll take the paperwork and all that stuff away from you for a fee. So you might be able to sort of construct something there that maybe makes it worth your while, depending on which of the bands were. So the thing to just Google for and chase up on is Commercialisation Australia.
Okay, I will add something just for the purpose of anybody here to that as well. There are other grants that are actually extraordinarily valuable. If you're going overseas, there's a market access program here in Victoria. It's MMV here, I think, MAP in South Australia. And then there's also the EMDG grants as well, which would basically work out to be about 50 cents in the dollar for your overseas travel. So if you are running a business where you're targeting people globally, you should tap those funds. They're actually relatively easy to access, extraordinarily valuable because it just reduces the cost.
The EMV one has reached its allocation this year.
Next year. And Commercialisation Australia, it can be very valuable. So we're going through the process now. I've used it in a previous business as well. And if you get it, it's some of the cheapest funding you can get.
Just on the Commercialisation Australia thing, I think they've had some like between 300 and 400 things that put up before the board, and like a 90+% yes rate. So and the people at the front are good at telling you what your chances are downstream. So yeah, it's kind of it's not going to cost you a lot to find out whether there's anything in it for you.
Thank you very much. And yes, we should probably mention Blue Chili and Envato, and thank you very much for helping us out.